the 135th meeting of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Typically, I remind witnesses, although I think Mr. Reid is well aware that we put our earpieces when not in use on the stickers in front of us to protect the well-being of our translators. Colleagues, we are here today on M109, Instruction to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, Amendments to the Standing Orders, and on the study of Bill C-65, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act. We will return to C-65 in the second hour of our affairs here today. But for the first hour, we have our colleague, Scott Reid, the MP for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston, with us. It's always nice when we have a colleague from the House of Commons that joins us in their capacity as a witness. So, Mr. Reid, we very much look forward to hearing from you today, sir. Thank you for making yourself available to the committee. I'll turn the floor over to you for 5 minutes. If you feel like you need a little bit more time, not a problem. And then we will head into our opening rounds of questions. So with that, colleagues, on va commencer. 5 minutes à vous.
We're going to begin. 5 minutes for you, Mr. Reid.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will speak English today because I speak faster in English and much slower in French.
If I get through this as quickly as I can. The purpose of motion M109 is to ensure that in the future it will be possible to amend the standing orders only with the consent of all recognized parties. This guarantee would be achieved by amending the standing orders so that when a debate on any future amendment is to the standing orders is underway, the rules which under all other circumstances can be used to limit debate will not apply. Henceforth, when the subject being debated is an amendment to the standing orders, the following 4 rules would cease to apply. Standing Order 56.1, 1B, Standing Order 57, which is the provision we normally mean when we use the term closure, Standing Order 61, which is also known as the previous question, and Standing Order 66.2c, which is what we usually mean when we refer to time allocation. If you examine the text of motion M109, you'll see that in Article B of the motion, the 4 subarticles designated by the lowercase Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, and 4 limit the application of the 4 debate-limiting rules that I've just enumerated. Additionally, motion M109 contains 2 additional subarticles designated at B5 and B Roman numeral 6. These subarticles serve the complementary purpose of ensuring that the standing orders cannot be amended via an opposition day motion or a private member's motion unless there is all-party consent. Instead, if any such motion, any private member's motion or opposition day motion amending the standing orders is approved in the House, it will be sent to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee to be studied and then referred back to the House within 75 days, which is exactly the same process being used for motion M109. If motion M109 is adopted, the practical result will be that the House, it will never be possible again, in the absence of all-party consent, for a mere majority in the House to force a vote on any proposed amendment to the standing orders. Another word for all-party consent, of course, is consensus. In the absence of consensus, debate would simply continue as long as one side is willing to continue putting up speakers. Now, importantly, all-party consensus is not the same thing as a requirement for unanimous consent. I think that a requirement for unanimous consent to change the standing orders, a sort of Canadian version of medieval Poland's liberum veto, would be unwise. And therefore, it's worth noting that, as a practical matter, the mechanism of delay by drawing out the debate is really only available to organized groups of a certain size. A group of MPs with 12 members, which under our rules is the minimum size to maintain recognized party status, is big enough, I think, to deny consent by proposing an endless series of sub-amendments and speakers. But an individual MP or a handful of MPs does not have the stamina needed to unilaterally sustain a protracted debate on a motion that has the resolute support of the other 330-odd members of the House. It's equally important to stress that motion M109 would in no way limit the use of closure, time allocation, or the previous question to any subject matter other than debates on the standing orders themselves. Motion M109 was unanimously approved, as we all know, on June 19th of this year, but I want to stress this did not cause any standing order changes to come into effect. Rather, the motion had 2 effects. first, of instructing the Procedure and House Affairs Committee to, and here I'm quoting, to undertake a study on the advisability of amending the standing orders, as outlined above, and second, of requiring that the committee report its findings to the House no later than 75 sitting days following the adoption of this motion. That means, in practical terms, that the committee has until late February to submit a report to the House. Now, if committee members wish, I can advise them as to what I'd suggest that the committee's report might say. My suggestion is based on the way in which this committee dealt 10 years ago with a similar motion that I had authored proposing to amend the standing orders to change the way in which the Speaker of the House of Commons is elected, change that ultimately was adopted by the House. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks, and I am at the disposal of the committee.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Reid. I will just take a moment to say it's a really fascinating piece of legislation and one that I'm looking forward to hearing debate on. Often at this committee, we have the privilege of working with legislation that has a direct impact on the working procedures and conditions that we as parliamentarians undertake every day. So thank you for being here and thank you for your opening remarks. Mr. Cooper, the floor will be yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Reid. Our standing orders descend from the House of Commons in Westminster. They are the rules of the game, as you stated in your second reading speech for this place. And over the past 150 years, a convention has developed whereby standing orders ought not to be changed absent consensus, correct?
That is the convention. It hasn't gelled as firmly as some other conventions that exist regarding, for example, the Confidence Convention is more firmly gelled, but I would say it's an incipient convention or a convention that is on its way to gelling.
How often, when you say it hasn't gelled in the same fashion, how often has it been that the standing orders have been changed absent consensus?
More times than I thought. I did ask in the course of preparing my remarks a very long time ago, I did ask the Library of Parliament to prepare a review of all the occasions on which the standing order has been changed without the consent of the House, and obviously had the consent without consensus. And they came up with a longer list than I thought. Some of them are fairly small changes, but the major ones, the ones I point to that really stand out, are let's see if I can get these right. And Andre is there and knows this stuff cold, so he can correct me if I miss anything. But in 1913, the previous question was used as a way of limiting debate to introduce what is the provision that we call closure. The closure provision was used in the 1960s to introduce what we call time allocation, 1968, I believe. And on that occasion, not a single opposition member from either the CCF, or NDP, I guess it was at that time, or the Progressive Conservatives supported the government on the changes. Was used again by the Mulroney government on at least one occasion, by the Chrétien government on, I believe, at least 2 occasions, and most recently by the current government in 2023, and that would have been with reference to changing the standing orders to allow virtual sittings of the House to be added as a permanent change to the standing orders. I know I've missed a few, but those are the big ones.
Well, and as you noted, Mr. Reid, through you, Mr. Chair, that in your speech, and you've just illustrated it, that closure has been consistently used when the goal is to change the standing orders in a fashion that would give new tools to the government to more effectively limit the amount of debate that takes place in the House of Commons. And is that a fair observation?
Yeah, well, I mean, time allocation came into existence. It would not have come into existence, at least not in its current form, without the use of closure. Closure would not have come into existence without the use of the previous question. And as for the previous question, that's something that we inherited from the British. I'm not exactly sure when, but we did so pre-Confederation. So yes, the tendency has been that this should surprise nobody, right? a government is motivated to want to restrict the ability to protract debate when it's finding the debate is too protracted, which by definition means at a time when the opposition is attempting to draw out debate. So I've gone to some lengths, both in my remarks in the House and today, to avoid commenting in some sort of general way on the merits of time allocation or closure. I was a deputy government House leader for 10 years, and so I was part of a government that used closure and time allocation on occasion. Some would say on more than one occasion. So I'm not trying to do that. But when it comes to placing further restrictions on the House's ability to debate, conduct business, to slow things down for the purpose of giving proper examination, I think that is, regardless of the partisan stripe of who's in office at that time, that is, I think, not the direction we want to head in. Everything about our system is designed to allow more debate to occur. That's why we have 3 readings on legislation. That's why we have committee hearings at which amendments can be suggested. The House essentially divides itself up into smaller bodies so that it can do multiple pieces of business at the same time. That's why we have 2 houses of Parliament instead of just one. We could be unicameral. All the provinces are. But I think it's actually wiser to be in the direction that has been employed by at our federal level or in all state legislatures in the U.S., all state legislatures in Australia, with one exception, of being bicameral. I think, in general, being slow and deliberate in your actions is reasonable. There are times when it's okay to move more quickly and to suspend the rules. That happened during COVID. For example, when the House was recalled, there were lengthy hearings. All-day hearings on, I think it was March the 20th, 2020, on suspending the standing orders. I remember I came to the House intending to deny unanimous consent when I thought that was what was going to happen. But once it became clear that there had to be discussions, the government and the opposition parties were able to cobble together something that ultimately was, I think, an improvement over what might initially have gone through. So you can, when there's need, find a way of getting to these things quickly, maybe somewhat messily, but quickly.
Thanks very much, Mr. Cooper. Ms. Romanato, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank Mr. Reid for being here with us today. And I want to start by saying that I, of course, support this motion and what Mr. Reid is trying to get to. One area that I wanted to check with Mr. Reid, and who has much more experience than I do in this, there is no reference to Standing Order 51.1 and 51.2 and 51.3, which is the requirement that between the 60th and 90th sitting days of Parliament on a day designated by the Minister of the Crown, that the House take note of the standing orders and procedures of the House and the committees. And basically, this is when we have the opportunity once every Parliament to have a wholesome discussion about the standing orders and make recommendations. And in Standing Order 51.2, we reference the expiration of proceedings deemed referred to committee. So I wanted to just get your opinion on would M109 need to encompass this part of, or could this stay as a standalone in your opinion?
I don't think M109 needs to deal with this. M109 deals with the expiration of debate resulting in something coming to a vote. I believe what happens here is upon the expiration of debate, the item simply drops from the order paper. So it's the opposite problem. But, sometimes you want to be able to sustain debate on things because you think we could achieve a result. What I'm proposing is basically to make it less easy to achieve a result. Sherry, I'm cheating, and I'm going back and answering one of Michael's questions here through twisting slightly what you asked me, okay? The whole idea of delay versus getting on with business quickly and the balancing act that's involved. You do have to be able to get on with business, obviously. But when we have a situation where there's an actual tie vote in the House of Commons, it's interesting what happens in that situation. The Speaker breaks the tie. But the Speaker doesn't stand up and say, well, I've thought it over, and I like this piece of legislation, so I'm voting for it. What the Speaker says. I remember the first time this happened when Peter Milliken was in the chair, and he knew that he might have to break a tie one day, and so he had a little piece of paper in his pocket ready for that moment. And he pulled it out and he said, the precedent is that when the Speaker is breaking a tie, the Speaker always does so in a way that continues the debate on the belief that it might be possible to achieve the necessary level of support, which of course is 50% plus one. And therefore, if it's an item at second reading, the Speaker votes in favor so that it can go forward. And if it's an item at third reading, this is obviously reference to bills, if it's at third reading, the Speaker votes against rather than causing it to leave the House and move on. So I think that is kind of the guidance here. That being said, I think your underlying question is this: could we beef up the standing orders with reference to the debates on the standing orders, or the process for reviewing the standing orders? And I agree, and I think something that we don't have room for here, at least it's not stated explicitly, is dealing with practices that are not part of the standing orders, right? So the practices of the House, that's all the stuff that you find in O'Brien and Bosk, right? That's all about our conventions and practices. I think we should spend some time looking at that. I think it would be helpful, for example, right now, if we could come to a clearer agreement on what constitutes parliamentary language and what constitutes unparliamentary language, so that we can be clear on what the naughty words are and what the naughty words aren't. And I think it would be helpful if we could have greater clarity for all of us as to, we have this thing we say where you can't do through the back door that which you can't do through the front door. I think a clearer understanding of what that is would be very helpful. It means when the Speaker stands up and says that's out of order, or when the Speaker declines to do so, there would be more legitimacy. We would all say what he or she is doing is we support that, even if we didn't get what we wanted on the point in question. There's greater support for the Speaker's action. That's the definition of legitimacy.
So I actually sat in on part of a study for the former Member of Parliament for Pierrefonds Dollard, Mr. Frank Bayless, when he introduced his PMB regarding sweeping changes to the standing orders. I believe you were actually on PROC. I'm not quite sure, but I recall being on that committee for that study, and it was changes such as limiting the power of parties to determine who speaks in question period, so on and so forth. It died on the order paper, but there was only about 2 hours of debate that would have been devoted to this extensive motion, and I believe you supported it at that time. Could you elaborate a little bit on your thoughts now on that?
Yeah, so Frank, yeah, right, it was a sweeping motion. I remember when I talked at the time, I said, I think, Frank, this might be a bit too sweeping. It's easier to get things through if they're modest in scope, which is part of the goal with M109, make it narrow in scope. But having said that, I mean, he was hitting at something that frustrates all of us, which is that we've allowed our practices to move us in the direction of greater centralization. The practice of a list being submitted to the Speaker there's no standing order about that. It's a practice. The Speaker could, in theory, say, I'm simply not looking at that list. I'm going to see who stands up and respond to that person, as still happens at least some of the time in the United Kingdom and in some other parliaments. But it's difficult for the Speaker to unilaterally say, I don't like that particular convention. The Speaker's all about following the precedents. And I chair my party's caucus. I mean, they don't want me to start saying I'm picking and choosing the conventions I like about how we behave there.
Mr. Reid, as much as I'd love to hear you talk about what goes on in your caucus room, so I will permit you a few more seconds, but if you could wrap up, that'd be great. Thank you.
That's very sage advice. I'm not supposed to speak at all about what happens there. As a matter of fact, I think the point is that he was, I think, moving towards using a standing order to lock in a replacement to a convention, and sometimes that's what's necessary when the conventions have gone in a direction that is no longer reflective of what the House thinks they ought to be.
Thank you, Ms. Romanato. Madame Gaudreau, 6 minutes à vous.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted to be discussing a substantive amendment to the standing orders where I was personally insulted. We've worked many hours on the PROC committee, and we at the Bloc tabled a dissenting report. Now, having said that, there was a multitude of recommendations that could lead to a consensus, and we understand that in an exceptional case like COVID, extraordinary measures were taken. But when it's over and we have to have a major amendment to the standing orders, I'm absolutely delighted that this be tabled today, because not only are people telling us, my constituents tell me, what is your committee for? Decisions are made behind the scenes with the House leaders' offices. Well, let me tell you something. There was no consultation among them, and that's unacceptable. So my question is, will this proposal guarantee that there won't be some kind of fast track or maneuver to not have this happen again? I'm sure that if motion 109 is accepted, there will be no way to fast track this, in good French, let's say to limit debate. That would be cancelled when it comes to discussions about the standing orders, just the standing orders. I thank my colleague for his French, because even in English, you have to speak slowly for our interpreters here. So I understand your good intentions. I may be on the government side, although they tabled this and they are trying to assuage their conscience by changing their mind. I don't know whether it's unanimous in your party, because when there's consensus in a legislative process, we're talking about democracy here. Yes, it's possible to accelerate when there's an emergency. Do you think your motion is likely to succeed? Is there a risk that it will be adopted? Yes, I think so. It was accepted unanimously. By the House. I think the idea of consensus, the level of consensus, is stronger than a majority, the 100% or 50% plus one. It's a very important idea in our federation. It's the reason why you have a few formulae to amend the Canadian Constitution. And the level of consensus necessary is higher for the parts of the Constitution that are most important. This is a concept that's absolutely essential in a real democracy. A majority democracy with no guardrails is not a real democracy. It's not a safe democracy. I think that the guardrails are always a good idea. In closing, I want to say, Mr. Chairman, that during the pandemic we noted, and these are the people of Laurentides-Labelle who told me, wow, you're working together, because we had a planetary issue going on, particularly within our borders, and we demonstrated that we were able to do this, able to work together. And I think that that's a moment that made me want to continue in politics. And I can say this now because I will never seek to be in power, be a minister. When people see that once the emergency is over and our system turns into partisanship at all costs. This is what we've been experiencing for months now. Your party is paralyzing government or parliament. It reassures me to see that the substantive rules of the House are such that I hope this will be adopted. In your opinion, will that allow us to review what was done in the past, or is it really for the future? To revisit previous decisions. Well, for example, the decision made in June. I'm sorry, I don't understand. I will ask you again in my 2.5-minute turn. It's no problem. It's the precedent, what came before and in the future. Can we go back to make changes, or do we start on day one? But we'll discuss it. It starts in the future. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau. I do appreciate that you mentioned that, yes, there are times where we can work together. I hope that will continue. Ms. Matheson.
It is the dream, Mr. Chair, yes. I wanted to ask, and I too am in favor of this. Actually, it's very nice to have this kind of conversation. I think it brings out the policy wonk in all of us, and our deep-rooted geekiness and love for this sort of stuff. But I know it does for Sherry anyway. I wanted to ask, though, I can't help but think of where we're at now. And the changes that you're talking about making to those standing orders, I do agree, because they are the rules that govern us all, that we need to be a part of the decision on how they're made. But again, within the context of what's happening now and that standstill that we find ourselves, this would add an additional point at which Parliament, like it could be used as a tool for that gamemanship, for that seizing of Parliament, for the filibusters that occur. Have you thought about that in any way in terms of the potential negative use of ideally a really positive idea?
Well, I've tried to constrain it as narrowly as possible, so it's really only dealing with changes to the standing orders themselves. So I think there is a valid parallel with the protracted debate that's been going on now in a very narrow sense, but a very, very narrow but important sense, which is this. If you want to see what in the future a debate would look like on an attempt to amend the standing orders that did not have all-party support, then what's going on in the House of Commons is actually a pretty good example of what it would look like. There'd be some kind of deadlock. And the point is not to cause that deadlock to occur, but rather, since it's obvious that it would happen, it's to make the government more, since one assumes it would normally be the government that's proposing changes to the standing orders, and most often a majority government, it would make them make it necessary for them to make compromises, so they might not get all that they would want. I think what's happening in the House right now is no change would occur because of this with regard to any debate on any subject other than the standing orders. And of course, what's happening in the House right now is not a debate on the standing orders; it's a debate on an order that the Speaker made, right?
And this is based, though, on the idea that there are majority governments most of the time. However, and I mean, I've only been here as an elected official 5 years, but I've worked on the Hill for over 15 now. 18, oh God. And in the majority of that time, it's been minority governments. So is that, were you considering that when there was a draft? Did you have any considerations of where it might go because of that seeming change of how governments are being elected?
Well, it's an interesting question because, Canada has veered back and forth between minority and majority governments. I was mostly thinking about the need to protect ourselves in the event of a majority government. It seems to me that the greatest procedural concerns are in existence when there's a majority government. But, I also tried in this to make it possible to amend the standing orders via private member's motion, which is, of course, what we're talking about doing today, only if the same rules are respected. You can't do an end run, produce a private member's motion on changing the standing orders, have it adopted after 2 hours of vote, and go into effect. That could be done. That could be an end run, and it could be done in theory by anybody. I suspect it could be done most effectively by having a government backbencher move a private member's motion to completely change the standing orders in whatever way the government wants. You have 2 hours of debate. It's through. So that was a hole I was very anxious to plug, actually. And so the process, Lindsay, I'm kind of cheating and using your question to answer a question you didn't ask. But I do think that the proper way, when a private member's motion contemplates changing the standing orders, the way to do it is to have that motion, if adopted, automatically be directed to this committee for whatever hearings seem appropriate, then to be referred back to the House after a set period of time. The motion suggests 75 days. And at that point, it would still be possible, if there were not consensus, for that debate, that concurrence debate, to be dragged out. Alternatively, if at the committee a consensus has been achieved, and there's no better place to achieve consensus than here. We'd all get input from our House leaders. It seems to me that that is a good way of ensuring that ideas can bubble up through the private member system. If they have flaws, those flaws can be, sometimes they're not attempts at force majeure, they're attempts at doing something with good faith, but something's been missed in the details. It's a good chance to catch it. So.
I'll see my time. That's fine. I'll wait.
I'll roll it over. Yeah. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Picking up in part on the part of the line of questioning put by Ms. Matheson, Mr. Reid, if you could clarify that if this motion were adopted and the standing orders were changed accordingly, if there was an attempt to change the standing orders where there wasn't consensus pursuant to the convention, theoretically that could result in a protracted debate in the House. Now, in terms of how that would impact other business of the House, could you clarify that it would take precedence, debate would take precedence of time of concurrence, but thereafter it would not take precedence, that it would only be debated at the adjournment of government business and therefore would not impede the government from moving forward other pieces of legislation?
The answer to your question is you've summarized it exactly right. It would not wind up gumming up the business of the House. Also, you know, it's if the government insisted on trying to push through a set of standing order changes that were opposed by the opposition parties, what would happen? It would be this endless debate. But of course, the government wouldn't try that. Since it's obviously pushing against an immovable object, it would recognize that it's necessary instead to go back and compromise on the substance of the standing order changes. And that's, in fact, what would happen. That is exactly what happened back in the example I gave in March 2020, when realizing that its initial proposal to change the standing orders would not be with success, the government House leader, at the time it was Pablo Rodriguez, stood up and simply said, Mr. Speaker, I ask that we suspend our proceedings while the House leaders meet to work out changes. And that's what actually happened. It took all day, but it wasn't endless. It took a day to sort out a very complicated series of changes, which included not just standing order issues, but also passing the CERB legislation. So that would be what would actually happen, is there'd be negotiations, mostly, I think, behind closed doors with the House leaders, which, of course, is already part of our routine. Every Tuesday, the House leaders meet or should meet to discuss all kinds of business that otherwise would, if conducted in a more formal venue, would be very time-consuming.
Thank you for that. Now, you cited the rare instances where governments have moved ahead absent a consensus to essentially put more hands, or more power, rather, in the hands of the government to control the business of the House. That being said, there have been in recent years attempts and successful attempts to change the standing orders in fairly significant ways. I can think of the McGrath Commission of 1985, the special committee set up by the Chrétien government. Perhaps you could elaborate on those processes and how the Mulroney government and the Chrétien government, and perhaps even the Harper government, you spoke a little bit about the changes to the standing order with respect to the election of the speaker. It'd be helpful if you could elaborate on how that worked itself out for a better understanding of the convention and historical context.
Well, the first two examples you cited, the McGrath Commission and the one under the Chrétien government, involve having a report done up on the assumption that some detailed research is required. It's a subject that requires detailed work. With regard to the motion to change how the speaker is elected, what happened in that occasion, and this I think is the model that could work in this situation. It was a private member's motion. It was moved by myself, sent to this committee. The committee reviewed the report, or the proposed standing order changes, and then it wrote back. It just happened to have its report right here, as a matter of fact. And the 21st report of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee stated, if you don't mind my quoting, "The election of the Speaker is a matter for all members to decide. The committee does not oppose nor endorse motion M489 brought forward by Mr. Scott Reid and feels that the entire membership of the House of Commons should have the opportunity to vote on whether or not to change the standing orders in the manner suggested by M489. In order to accomplish this purpose of having a vote in our House, the committee recommends that Standing Order 4 be amended as follows." Then what followed was the suggested motion to change the House. So the point about all this was it allowed the members to make the decision. And what actually happened in the House was that it was a completely free vote. And every single party in the House, even the Green Party, divided, and at least one member went on either side. The Greens, the Bloc, the NDP, and also the Liberals and Conservatives. And the result was that it passed by I can't remember the exact number, but it passed by some number, obviously. I think that's a good model here.
Thanks very much, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Turnbull, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to Mr. Reid for being here. I note that we had some good nerdy PROC-related discussions in the past on the Code of Conduct for members of Parliament when we did some work on that, which was overdue. And so I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you putting forward M109 and the chance to just engage with you on this. I note that Ms. Romanato brought up in 2019 your work with Frank Baylis, and I think of another group of MPs that at the time put forward some pretty sweeping changes to the standing orders. So that's kind of the end run almost that you described, which is kind of interesting so I wondered, you kind of went that path in trying to change the standing orders through a private member's motion that were pretty sweeping, some of which I agree with, the parallel debating chamber. So I'm not saying I wouldn't have necessarily supported those changes, but you did so in the way that you're now trying to prevent with this motion. So are you kind of having a moment of conscience here where you're trying to prevent your former self from what it was maybe inclined to do back then?
Well, in all fairness,
I mean that in jest a little bit.
Of course. No. So in all fairness, that was not my motion. That was Frank's motion, which I supported. I think what Frank was up against, if memory serves correctly, was we were right at the end of a parliament and it was going to be hard for him to get it through. I think that was what was driving him. And anybody who's ever had a private member's motion or bill that comes up towards the end of a parliament knows that feeling. So I have sympathy with what he was trying to do. I think in practice, he was biting off a very, very large chunk, and it would have been difficult to deal with it all and to give the proper, something like setting up a parallel chamber, you really have to sit down and look at the other places that have done it, the Australians, British, and see how well what they've proposed works. And that was not the only subject matter. There were a number of other things he had in there. The motion that I proposed that dealt with the election of the Speaker, a narrower topic, using a preferential ballot for electing the Speaker. Initially, I just had this idea we would put this forward and it would be debated, and then the House would adopt it. And it was in the process that wiser heads than my own directed and said this really ought to go to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and in retrospect, they were 100% right. It was helpful to go. It was helpful to see what other jurisdictions had done. We are not the first ones to try this. The British do it in the House of Commons and the House of Lords as well. And that was very, very informative and useful.
So it sounds like you've been learning along the way, just, which I think we all do. One of the questions I have is, this motion would, assuming it goes through and everyone supports it, which I think is likely, but, so PROC would have to study any substantive changes to the standing order in the future. One of the challenges I find is we get members on PROC that are a bit nerdy about procedure. I mean, even Ms. Matheson said she was happy to nerd out on this topic, and I myself put myself in that category. But many other members of Parliament are not on PROC. How do we ensure that they have a fulsome understanding of what the proposed changes to the standing orders would imply for the practices of Parliament, such that they can make an informed decision when they're voting? So question to you, and then I have another one to follow up to that.
I think it's a problem you've got with any piece of legislation or any change to the standing orders. We all have an obligation to either inform ourselves or, as I often do, to find somebody whose knowledge and insight you trust deeply and consult with them. I know I regularly rely on Michael Chong, for example, and Tom Comich as two people who I think have insights that I wouldn't have on my own. I think that's the best way of doing it. Yeah, maybe I'll just stop there.
So, and your motion allows essentially that every member of Parliament would have an opportunity to speak in the House on any proposed changes to the standing orders, and that there could be no essentially limit to that debate. So it could be as protracted as it needs to be potentially. But how do you ensure that a majority government couldn't whip a vote? Because essentially I think you're ensuring that the vote might be procedurally free, but it wouldn't necessarily be politically free. So in the case of a majority government, at any point in the future, they could propose changes to the standing order. If it comes to a vote, obviously they could whip that vote.
Yeah, so the answer is that nothing that I'm proposing would preclude whipped votes. In fact, I think they typically, I think they likely would be whipped votes in many cases. What I've suggested here is a method that would, if the parties agree, lead to a free vote. But it could be a whipped vote. Nothing, nothing that happened in the motion I read or the report from the committee 10 years ago precluded parties from holding whipped votes if they wanted to. That's an internal matter but obviously when you get all party consensus, by definition, you're saying that the party leadership and the party caucus, through whatever internal mechanism it has decided as a whole either to say we'll have a free vote on this or we'll have a whipped vote. But presumably the key point is the whipped vote, if there is one, is in favor. If one party says we're having a whipped vote against it, then you'll get all those speakers. If we're voting in favor, then many people will choose not to participate in the debate. There'll be no need for them to do so.
We're a minute over. Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. I appreciate that. Mr. Reid, I know you talked earlier about what's on the naughty list. I don't know if the word nerd is unparliamentary, but since it's self-professed on the part of members, I'm going to let it slide. Madame Gaudreau, 2 minutes 30 secondes.
Ms. Gaudreau, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I have left is a comment, among other things. To my mind, a substantial rule is necessary. It's necessary that it be a free vote. Now, that also leads me to wonder, because honestly, each legislator we can look at what goes on elsewhere in the world. These are all free votes. So I hope that members of Parliament here really agree with the whipped votes of the party lines, because otherwise people looking at us will say, well, that's the cynical part of politics. So I am very in favor of a free vote, but it be consensual. I hope we could go even further, that we keep tactics and parliamentary strategies, but I went through a 44-hour filibuster. It's awful to go through that. It makes no sense for the people who need us. So that's a comment. I don't know whether you want to react. You have 1 minute left. I don't really have any comment about processes that are going on in the House of Commons right now. But when it comes to the question of free votes, there are those who think that in Canada's Parliament, all votes are whipped votes, totally under the control of the respective parties, that members of Parliament are trained seals, to use an expression that an old phrase, an old expression. I think that does not reflect reality. In a parliament, a Westminster parliament, you have parties, and parties have a position that is determined by convention. You vote for the budget, let's say, or all the financial measures. If you're in the government party, or if you're in opposition, you vote against it. That is part and parcel of our system. You have measures that are you have private members' bills, and there is a space for individual ideas there. Now, I think that free votes in this space are a very important part of our political system here. Thank you. That takes up all my time, but I appreciate my colleagues' French.
From before, so you'll have 2 minutes and 50 seconds.
Wow, fancy. I just wanted to double check. I'm not sure. Are we going to be hearing from House administration on this piece of legislation as well?
Currently, that is not scheduled. Of course, the committee can make its own determination on that, Ms. Matheson.
Okay. I would suggest it, although I did want to hear from Mr. Reid about the consultations that he did or maybe he didn't do on that with House administration, and what were the overall feelings, or were there any suggestions that they provided?
Well, yeah, the wording of the motion changed from, in my head, it was, it looked a lot simpler than it wound up being. When you're trying to change the standing orders, it's very difficult to write something grandiose sounding. You really have to go and say, this rule is being tweaked this way, that rule is being tweaked that way, in order to make it fit in to the existing set of standing orders. And that was with the assistance of the clerks who understand this stuff so much better than I do. So that was where the consultation took place.
The only other question I have, it's my concern. You were mentioning before about this centralization of power, the role of leaders, House leaders, whips, so on, and that. It seems to me that, in my concern, we were discussing rules around harassment, and it was my. I sort of got to this point where, especially within the House, we can write all the rules we want, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of peer pressure involved. There's a lot of acceptance of how we behave and so on. Is that the sort of same feeling in terms of the standing orders that you have, that we can change these rules, but there has to be something further? And what would you suggest in terms of that something further to get us to a point where we do come to consensus, that we do seem to recognize that there are things that are bigger, like, you know, a pandemic or something like that, that we can move past this to a better place that actually serves Canadians as it's supposed to.
About 30 seconds, Mr. Reid.
I think the most important thing is that people like me who are trying to change the rules, you are dealing with an institution which is several hundred years old. And the Canadian Parliament has roots that go back to 1791, and before that, at Westminster for centuries beyond. Understand we should be making modest adjustments. We're not revolutionaries. There's other places where you can be a revolutionary more effectively. We're dealing with the standing orders. You say I'm a small part of a long continuum or stream. I should keep them as small as possible and let the conventions that are evolving and generally evolving in the right direction, I believe, on the whole. You know, we're more inclusive of, for example, nursing mothers in the House of Commons than was true when I came here a quarter of a century ago. And there's a zillion other examples. We've got rules on harassment now we didn't in the past. And I could think of more examples, but I'd run out of time. I think we're heading in the right direction in terms of our conventions for the most part. We should only adjust on a limited basis through statutory change, not the kind I'm considering.
Very much, Ms. Matheson. My understanding is Conservatives have ceded their time back to the committee. Tu veux une question?
Oui. Je
OK,
veux une
excuse,
question.
j'ai mal compris. OK,
Oui,
mais
j'ai dit un petit peu. Ça sera...
It really won't be long. Please go ahead. 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, listen, this is an issue that's quite important. I think we could test it and see whether we can get a consensus here. I agree with Ms. Matheson, who suggested we should get along, but the leaders and the House of Commons, the clerk and so on, could hold a meeting for 1 hour so we can question all the implications of M109. So if everyone agrees, we could ask the clerk to arrange a meeting, a 1 hour meeting, with the House clerk, the law clerk, and so forth. I think that's a good idea, given the changes that could occur. So if everyone agrees, okay. So do you agree that, yes, but I have other points. Okay, but for those, if you agree, I think it would be a good idea to have the House authorities with us to answer questions. Perhaps what we could do
is I'm getting the sense that there is some agreement here, but if we can maybe just save that for the very end, and then because Ms. Romanato, once she gets the floor, has a couple of questions. Mr. Berthold, we'll come back to that to just get consensus from the committee that they do in fact want to hear before Mr. Reid leaves. To set the kind of committee business aspect of that. We don't need to use your time to do that. We can come back, of course, because I just want to allow for some discussion before we...
Monsieur le Président, c'était uniquement...
Well, Mr. Chairman, it was just a proposal because I thought my NPD colleague's suggestion was a good one. Let's proceed. Okay, I agree. We'll just go to Ms. Romanato for 5 minutes and then we'll come back soon to decide whether we will invite several witnesses or more witnesses.
5 minutes. And colleagues, just while Ms. Romanato has the floor, if you could actually just give some thought, please. I'll just come around quickly, but give some thought to Monsieur Berthoud's suggestions so that we can just very quickly move on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I probably won't take the full 5 minutes. I just wanted to get clarity. Mr. Reid, my colleague mentioned about the at the end of the day, if a whip whips a vote, wouldn't that undo the intent? But I think actually the intent of this bill is to make sure that all members are heard or have the opportunity, should they want to debate an item with respect to the changing of the standing orders. It's not at the end of the day what the outcome of a vote would be, but at least this way it's not a government being able to limit the debate or limit people's ability to participate in that debate. Is that correct? That's sort of the intent of this bill. Is that correct?
Well, not quite. Actually, the intent is not that all members be heard. That's why I specifically made the point about unanimous consent is not being sought here. All parties, all recognized parties being sought.
That's where I was going with this.
Okay.
You mentioned all recognized parties in your, when you had debate on this bill. Recognized parties currently is 12 members. We are moving to 343 after the next election. Do you think that that also needs to be reflected? We also have had situations where we have more people sitting as independents that therefore if we go with only recognized parties or a consensus versus unanimous consent, which I can understand, but that also limits the ability of smaller parties then having an opportunity to weigh in on that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think if you're a very small group, it would be hard to have a significant impact on this debate. The reason for, look, we could go to, say, unanimous consent. The reason for not doing that is once you've got one member who can hold things up, they've now got a basis for log rolling.
Yeah.
So is that really what you want? That's why I mentioned the liberum veto. If you want to just go and read about the liberum veto online, it was how the Polish parliament was run in the 17th and 18th century, and it was not a very effective way of running a government, I'll just say that.
And just before we end, is there any other aspects of this motion that you think that we should strengthen to ensure the intent of it is fully realized?
Well, of course, I think it's perfect the way it's written. No, but I think maybe something to think about is if you're looking for things to ask witnesses about, you might want to just inquire about the way in which opposition day motions and private members' motions are being dealt with. That's Romanets 5 and 6, I think, in the list. They're being treated a little bit differently than the closure and time allocation items that are simply being put off the table. And the clerks might have something interesting to say about that.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Great. Okay, colleagues, I feel like I returned to second-year political philosophy class today. It was a very fruitful discussion. I went around the table briefly there, and there seems to be agreement that we have another meeting on M109 to invite both House administration and potentially others. However, what I did hear from colleagues is that there is a desire to make sure that C65 is tended to before we were to call another meeting on M109. I'm looking around. I feel as though head nods are telling me there's implied majority here. If colleagues want to vote, we can do that. But je pense que Madame Gaudreau.
But I think Ms. Gaudreau and Mr. Berthold and other members who want me to explain this in French, I spoke with members. There is a consensus that we will have another meeting of at least 1 hour for M109, but we've finished with C60. We should have finished with C65 before we have a meeting to continue on M199. There's a consensus there, a majority saying yes.
Is that clear to everybody? Okay, so I'll work with the clerk to make sure we find time in the calendar. Please make sure that you do submit witnesses beyond House administration for that one meeting. Other than that, Mr. Reid, thank you very much for availing yourself to the committee and for your thoughtful insights today. Colleagues, we do have a couple of witnesses for our next round online, so we're going to have to just briefly suspend in order to transition over, and we'll be back in a few minutes for our next hour on C65. Jusqu'à 1 heure.
Till 1 o'clock. Sorry. My question is, what's the delay for the witnesses for 109? Good question. There's probably time, a few weeks, but we can talk about that after the meeting. Thank you.
Welcome back. We are going to, okay, colleagues, we're underway here. Just bring the noise level in the room down a little bit. Thank you. Welcome. I see we've got Mr. Barlow and Ms. Barron that are here, so welcome to PROC, colleagues. We are continuing our study on Bill C-65, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act. The witnesses appearing today are those that we had slated to appear last week, but the affairs of the committee made it such that we weren't able to hear from them at that point, but we're going to try that again. So I'd like to welcome from Apathy is Boring, Samantha Royce, the Executive Director, appearing as an individual, Daniel Mulroy, a lawyer who is appearing by video conference, and from the Indo-Caribbean Educators Network, Peter DeBoren, Principal, retired member of the Steering Committee, who is also appearing by video conference. Each witness will have upwards of 5 minutes, beginning with Ms. Royce, followed by Mr. Mulroy and Mr. DeBoren to give opening statements. We will then go into a line of questioning from members of each political party. With that, Ms. Royce, I turn the floor over to you, and I certainly hope I've pronounced your name properly, as I've said it 3 times now. So thank
You're
you.
fine.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Sam Rouche, and I'm the Executive Director of Apathy is Boring. Founded in 2004, we are the largest national nonpartisan organization that engages young Canadians aged 18 to 34 in our democracy. We are proud to work with youth from all sides of the political spectrum. It's not about who they vote for, but rather that they participate in the democratic process and have their voices heard on issues that matter most to them, including the economy, housing, equality, and affordability. I'm here today to express support for several amendments included in C-65, while also providing the real-world perspective on how to improve this bill to increase voter turnout and trust in our institutions amongst youth. First, I want to address the proposed amendments related to on-campus voting. We know from our work across the country that when young people are given accessible and convenient ways to participate in Canada's democratic process, they're more likely to vote. On-campus polling stations also provide meaningful opportunities for student organizations to engage young electors on campus. Importantly, this sends a powerful message to Canadian youth that their vote matters, something that is essential to reducing motivational barriers to participation. Second, Apathy is Boring also strongly supports the proposed amendments targeting election interference. Further, we support the latest recommendations by the Chief Electoral Officer, which call for expanding the current foreign interference measures to apply at all times. Deceptive campaigns that manipulate and distort public opinion harm Canada's democracy and must be banned. When hidden resources are used to mislead, divide, and push agendas without Canadians' knowledge, Canada's democratic process is undermined, and our collective trust in institutions is put at risk. This is a risk that we cannot afford. Importantly, this is not an issue of freedom of speech. It's a matter of removing the ability for specific actors to deceptively influence our elections directly or to finance those activities furtively. Making disinformation that seeks to undermine or influence our elections illegal and prohibitively costly is a crucial first step to addressing this risk. Youth have a huge stake in preserving our democracy and, perhaps especially, in our capacity to engage in genuine democratic discourse in our increasingly digital world. Moreover, we must increase awareness of this subject amongst Canadians through transparent and effective oversight and enforcement to underscore the serious nature of safeguarding our elections. Lastly, while we commend the work undertaken to date to improve the Canada Elections Act and Canada's democratic process, let me close my remarks by providing a final recommendation to further improve the system under which we collectively operate towards a more inclusive, resilient, and informed democracy. While C-65 directs Elections Canada to further study a 3-day voting period, we recommend expanding the scope of this recommendation to weekend voting, as examining both in parallel would be the most efficient use of government resources and could assess the impact in both urban and rural Canada. Indeed, research suggests that holding elections on weekends could increase voter turnout. Weekend voting addresses a prominent barrier, lack of time, cited by 1 in 4 non-voters as the reason they didn't vote in the 2019 election. This lack of time has only been exacerbated by the cost of living crisis that Canadians are facing. Youth are one of the largest groups of non-voters, and in the most recent survey data, 78% believed weekend voting would make it easier for them to vote. By prioritizing weekend voting, we would ensure that every citizen has the opportunity to exercise their right to vote, regardless of their schedule or other commitments. Thank you for your time and consideration. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rush. Mr. Mulroy, the floor is yours for upwards of 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good afternoon, committee members. First, I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to make today's submissions, and a particular thank you to those who aided in the rescheduling of today. My name is Daniel Mulroy, and I'm here in my capacity as a human rights and constitutional lawyer, disability rights advocate, and on behalf of my client, Mr. Dean Stacey, to address accessibility of voting for persons with disabilities. Through my brief submissions, I'll introduce Mr. Stacey and his experience as a disabled voter, the legislative mandate which requires Elections Canada to explore accessible electronic voting options to accommodate disabled Canadians, and I will request that this committee consider telephone voting as a viable and secure means of accommodating and franchising disabled voters. Mr. Stacey, who intended on being here today, but due to accessibility issues with the Zoom link we'll be viewing through ParlaView, has voted in every provincial and federal election since turning 18. From 1976 through to 2003, he was able to cast his ballot secretly, meaningfully, and independently in accordance with his rights guaranteed under Section 3 of the Charter. However, in 2003, Mr. Stacey permanently lost sight in both of his eyes. And since losing his sight, he's lost the ability to secretly, meaningfully, and independently cast his vote in federal elections. Mr. Stacey's experience is not unique. Arguably, the most fundamental barrier for persons with disabilities is the exclusive reliance on the paper ballot and the unwillingness to adopt solutions based on available, accessible, and secure technology. Allowing these barriers to continue puts Canada in violation of human rights, the Charter, and its international obligations pursuant to Article 29 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Mr. Stacey is currently in the final stages of launching a charter challenge against the Canada Elections Act, alleging violations of Sections 3 and 15 of the Charter, as it denies persons with disabilities the opportunity to meaningfully participate in the electoral process and discriminates against disabled electors. I am here today on his instructions to exhaust all avenues before returning to the courts. Elections Canada has long recognized the existence of discriminatory barriers in our elections process, and since 1998 has been aware that 1, technology is essential to accessible voting, and 2, that telephone voting is the most viable and secure option. Parliament has also provided Elections Canada with a clear mandate to explore electronic voting options. In 2014, Section 18.1 of the Canada Elections Act was enacted, requesting that the Chief Electoral Officer devise, test, and study an alternative electronic voting process for use in future elections with Parliament's approval. Despite this mandate, and to my knowledge, no alternative voting process has been tested or proposed for adoption by Parliament. Further, in 2018, Section 18.1 was amended through the inclusion of subsection 3, which states that the Chief Electoral Officer shall develop, obtain, or adapt voting technology for use by electors with disabilities and may test technology for future use in an election, and subsection 4, which provides that voting technology used for the inclusion of disabled electors need only the approval of the responsible committees of the Senate and the House of Commons for its use in future elections. However, the Chief Electoral Officer has not developed, obtained, or adapted any such voting technology or sought approval for its use in a federal election. It is unacceptable that removing the major barrier to inclusive, independent, and confidential voting by persons with disabilities has not been accomplished, despite the clear mandate handed to the Chief Electoral Officer 10 years ago, and the information being available to Elections Canada for the last 25 years. Telephone voting stands as the most secure, viable, and accommodating voting procedure available, and would represent an enormous step forward for individuals facing informational barriers, literacy barriers, transportation barriers, and those with visual barriers like Mr. Stacey. We respectfully ask this committee to review and report on whether Elections Canada has fulfilled its legislative mandate under Section 18.1 and report on the efficacy of telephone voting as an accommodation which will enable persons with disabilities to exercise their democratic rights on an accessible and equal basis. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mulroy. Mr. DeBoer, the floor is yours for upwards of 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair and everyone. Thank you so much for your kind re-invitation to present to you today on behalf of ISEN and hear about the concerns of ISEN, the Indo-Caribbean Educators Network, vis-a-vis our letter in support of amendments to Bill C-65. As you're all well aware, Canadian society has come a long way in recognizing the basic human rights of each of us, starting with the legal status of women, Canadians of African heritage, Indigenous rights, queer rights, and gender expression rights, and so on. As we have progressed, there has been a focus on recognizing people's lived experiences as a way to, if not eliminate, then at least to ameliorate the effects of discrimination and exclusion of marginalized individuals and groups of people in our society. Yet, despite this, there's little information available about the peoples of the Caribbean diaspora in Canada. We know about specific countries there, for example, Jamaica or Guyana or Guadeloupe. But what is not known is that these countries are comprised of highly multicultural populations and that peoples on the subcontinent of India before partition make up the largest or the second largest ethnic group in many of these countries. This is due to the colonial expansion of the English, French, and Dutch empires, for example, which forced the migration of Indian workers starting from the very early 1800s to the early 1900s. These peoples have contributed immensely to the cultures, languages, foods, politics, economy, and the arts of each of the countries they were brought to. In Trinidad, for example, where my family is originally from, the largest ethnic group is actually of Indian ancestry. The second largest is of African ancestry. The culture is infused with strains of Portuguese, Spanish, Chinese, Syrian, Lebanese, Jewish, and the last of the indigenous peoples running through the heart and the history of the peoples of this island, which for decades was known as the most multicultural country in the world. That honor was bestowed on another country in the 70s, and we're all, I believe, the richer for it. These hybridized peoples of Trinidad have successfully exported calypso, soca, a blend of African and Indian musical traditions, chutney, and delicious curried chicken rotis and doubles to the rest of the world. And it is my hope that if you have never tried a good Trini roti, you will find a way to do it soon. That said, the ancient country that they came from, India, has a cultural and religious tradition that has been dated objectively back as far as 8,000 years ago, and at its height, around the years 1500 to 3000 BCE, produced vast works of literature, including the world's longest epic poem, the Mahabharata, dwarfing other epic poems hailing from Greece and Rome. Prior to European colonization, India was the richest country on earth for well over 1,000 years, with a GDP comprising almost 1/4 of the world's GDP combined. Therefore, it will not surprise you to know that the highly developed cultural and religious traditions of classical India have endured in the practices of its peoples wherever and however they went. The Indian diaspora, whether in Mauritius, Singapore, South Africa, and throughout the Caribbean, has contributed to and influenced the countries it has found itself in via its foods, music, dress, and religions. Hinduism, a religion that does not seek to convert, is the third largest religion in the world after Christianity and Islam. And this is why we find it necessary to entreat you today. Although we Indians from the Caribbean are a minority group within the Caribbean, and more so in Canada, we wish to share with you that Diwali, a major holy day, is practiced and observed and celebrated by Hindus in every country they have shared their culture with. Diwali, known as the Festival of Lights worldwide, is nationally recognized and celebrated across countries such as Trinidad and Guyana in the Caribbean, Mauritius, Malaysia, and Singapore, India, Nepal, and other countries across the world. In other words, the whole country celebrates Diwali. Not only people who identify as belonging to the Hindu tradition, Diwali holds immense significance for the Hindu, Jain, Sikh, and much of the Buddhist communities and symbolizes the triumphs of good over evil, deliberation over impetuousness, insight over ignorance. Diwali also marks the Hindu New Year for some communities, thus making it a blessed occasion for new beginnings. In northern India, it is usually a 5-day celebration. It is time for families and friends to come together in celebration, reflection, and prayer. To provide some context of ISON's involvement,
Mr. DeBoran,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. As much as I think the testimony you're providing is quite fruitful and helpful, we are over time. If I can ask you to just come to the conclusion of your remarks, please, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that we are here on behalf of the many people who celebrate within their cultures across this country of ours. And quite frankly, we have found in the past that our electoral days have been set on Diwali. For example, in 2022, there was consternation across the whole of Southern Ontario with hundreds of thousands of communities unable to actually go to the voting process because they were unable to they had to choose between their faith and their civic duties. We are saying that while Canada is justifiably proud of its tradition as a multicultural country, we ask that we urge all of you to look to set future dates for elections with a sensitivity and a respect to the many thousands of Hindus and other multicultural communities who will be observing Diwali in 2025. And as you move forward in future, please take a look at other religious traditions that are just as important in our multicultural society as those who practice the Christian and Jewish faiths. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Duncan, the floor will be yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us this afternoon. Mr. DeBoran, I want to ask a question, as you've outlined and gave a very good, we're always learning new things, some more details about Diwali. And you mentioned that by the proposal of moving the election date back a week from October 20th to October 27th did get, and has got, rightfully so, a lot of negative feedback, not on the Diwali aspect so much as what was seen as moving the election date back a week for pension guarantees for MPs that would miss it otherwise by a day. I just want to ask for you to be on the record. In order to not conflict with Diwali next year and the fixed election date, the only option is not just to move it back 1 week to October 27th, as was proposed by the NDP and Liberals. In fact, the election date could be moved in advance ahead to not conflict with the Diwali and the celebrations that go on. Now, 1 week before would be Monday, October 13th, would be Thanksgiving. I think we would agree that would not be an ideal time. But if I were to say Monday, October the 6th, would that be a date that would not conflict and be appropriate as well?
Absolutely. The main concern for many of the thousands of people who were conflicted by this is, like I said, on the one hand, we have a country that purports to say we're multicultural and respect all cultures and faiths and traditions. And yet, on the other hand, there was this arbitrary date that was chosen. So I believe, yes, I think the October 6th would work very well.
I appreciate that. And one of the things I think about Diwali, too, is a multi-day celebration. I know in my part of Eastern Ontario, I always have an interesting Thanksgiving weekend where on Saturday I have a Thanksgiving meal with my family, and then I go to a large Diwali celebration at the Benson Centre in Cornwall. So I appreciate your clarification there that the election date did not need to move back a week in order to accommodate what you have requested. In fact, the fixed date could be moved ahead to any other time besides the 20th. So I appreciate you clarifying that for us. Ms. Rouch, I want to ask... thank you.
Like you, I come from a multi-faith family, so we also celebrate Thanksgiving as well as Diwali.
A busy weekend for all of us. Good. Ms. Rouch, I want to ask you actually a bit of a different angle on youth being involved in our democratic process. You've mentioned and highlighted in your opening statement about voting, which is obviously very key of getting younger people to cast a ballot. One of the other things I think that's interesting and hasn't been discussed or raised too much yet in our deliberation of C65 is actually young people working for Elections Canada and participating through employment if they're students or looking for part-time work or extra hours. One of the things I want to raise or flag and maybe get your initial opinion on is in the proposal, section 31.2 of the bill, we're adding 2 extra advanced poll days. One of the concerns I have, and I'll ask Mr. Mulroy maybe in his work as a lawyer and for disability rights, both for young people, those with disabilities, seniors. Having 4 days of advanced polls now requires somebody to work 48 hours over 4 days. The polls are open 12 hours per day. Now by going to 6, the way that it's written, and if Elections Canada doesn't change their employment rules, we're asking either a young person, a person with disabilities, a senior, to work 72 hours over 6 days, plus their travel time each day, plus setup and takedown, plus the training. Do you see that if we don't get some change in, I think, what's been done before, we're going to see young people not participate by being able to work the elections as well and participate in that aspect of our democracy?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. I don't have an easy answer to this question. I know it's something that we're working with Elections Canada on to recruit more young people to work at the elections. I hadn't considered the time frame of the extra working hours. I'd be happy to submit a longer response in writing, but my initial thought is just that perhaps there could be additional recruitment done, but I'm not sure about the exacts.
And I think that's one of the things we should get clarification on, because if we're asking that requirement as what's been done with the 4 days and there's not a change to the 6, we might see all demographics, not just young people, but saying I can't do 72 hours over 6 days plus the other requirements. And we face further challenges to voting accessibility if there's not enough poll workers in local communities and neighborhoods to do that. Mr. Mulroy, can I ask you from your end and your work as for disability rights and your work as a lawyer, from an employment perspective as well with Elections Canada, would that be a flag to you and something we should be getting some clarification or details from Elections Canada on how they would handle this advanced poll day change?
I mean, it's certainly outside of my expertise, but you've raised an interesting question in that it may, so getting more information on that would likely be beneficial.
Appreciate that.
From an accessibility perspective, I mean, the more days that an individual is able to vote is certainly the better. But again, the system that's being purported is in-person paper ballots, which still has a number of barriers for persons with disabilities.
And just recognizing my time, I'll just say on there, I'd be interested in any comments that the witnesses would have in writing afterwards on this. I call it an undercurrent of some of these bills of where we have good, good intentions, not saying there's not on adding advanced poll days, but we need to make sure we have sufficient election workers, that there's polls in neighborhoods close to people where they live and accessible in that format. So any comments you may have on the employment side and the accessibility of polls close to home would be much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Ms. Romanado, the floor will be yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. I just want to follow up on something that my colleague, MP Duncan, mentioned. He mentioned in his line of questioning to advance the date, perhaps the week of October 13th. Obviously, we cannot. It is both Thanksgiving and on Monday, October 6th, is actually Sukkot, a Jewish high holiday. The week prior is September 30th, Truth and Reconciliation in Newfoundland and Labrador municipal elections. Week prior to that is Rosh Hashanah, and on September 1st is Labor Day. So I've looked at the length of the campaign. It has to be between 37 and 51 days. Mathematically, I looked at all of the Mondays in the fall, and unfortunately, there are many, many Mondays that have conflicts. But further to that, my question is actually for Ms. Rouch. I hope I said it right. I had the great pleasure of being on the Electoral Reform Committee back in 2016. And Apathy is Boring presented to us actually at that time, and it was on October 3rd, 2016 in Montreal. At the time, Carolyn Lutfi presented to us. And we heard from her that, and you mentioned something along these lines, that if youth don't vote in their first 2 elections upon eligibility, then it's very likely they will not continue to vote. And at that time, it was suggested that perhaps we should look at piloting online voting. You didn't mention that in your remarks. You did mention the weekend voting, which I'll get to. But what are your thoughts on that? It's not something that we did recommend at that time for many reasons, including now we see a lot more with respect to foreign interference in elections, and the use of cyber attacks. But what are your thoughts on that? You didn't mention it, and I just wanted to see if there's been a change in your position on that.
Thank you for that question. We don't have a formal position on online voting at the moment. I think it's something that, to my knowledge, hasn't been explored by Elections Canada up to this point, and so it feels like something that's quite far away. I know some provinces are piloting various methods. I think similar to you, obviously ensuring that the elections are secure and that Canadians and electors have faith in the results and how they're counted is paramount for us, given that we've seen, especially since 2016, declining trust in our elections, and we have a fear that that declining trust could extend to electoral administration, as we've seen in other, parts of the world. And so I think that would be a primary consideration that I would just name, and that in any study that's done with respect to online or other forms of ballots or voting, that be considered as well.
So further to that, actually, I'm going to build on that. I just returned from the Halifax International Security Forum, where we discussed a lot about disinformation, misinformation, the use of AI, and the concern about deepfakes. If we already have a situation where citizens are very weary about what they're seeing online, is it in fact true? Is it not? Do you think that C-65 goes far enough in terms of preventing the use of deepfakes? We heard from the Chief Electoral Officer that one of the concerns was it's one thing to have a candidate or someone pretending to be the candidate, but it's another thing to have the voiceover or a video over of a candidate saying something that they actually did not say. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a difficult question to answer because, of course, I think everyone thinks that they're capable of spotting disinformation and misinformation or deepfakes and all those things. And in all likelihood, we're probably way worse at it than we think. So our level of confidence is perhaps making it more challenging for us to recognize these things. It's a little bit outside the scope of my expertise in that I'm not an expert in AI or deepfakes, but I will say that I do think that the Chief Electoral Officer's recommendations are good ones and that they should certainly be considered by this committee. We do support the recommendations made certainly around strengthening the legal framework around the regulations on foreign interference, and I think that will also make a big difference in this case.
And my last question, I'm looking at the chair, I think I have some time. Weekend voting, I know that at the time, electoral reform, there was a lot of concerns for people who, especially young people who work on weekends, that they go to school during the week, so on weekends, that is their only opportunity to, work, to be able to pay for their studies. And we also heard from gig workers, people who work in, whether it be the retail industry and so on and so forth, as well as people who work the Monday to Friday 9 to 5 saying the only days I have off are the Saturday, Sunday. I have to do the grocery and the laundry and clean the house and so on. So they actually prefer to keep it on the Monday. Is this still, in your experience, the feeling that you're hearing? Do you have any data to support why we should move to weekend voting?
Thank you for that question. As I said, in our experience and research that we've done, we found that almost 80% of young people felt that weekend voting would make it easier for them to participate. Everyone has different circumstances. There are many young people who work, as you say, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and having 2 days as opposed to one, I think, is beneficial. I know there are some challenges with 3-day voting, particularly around polling stations and leasing and various administrative elements that are a little bit outside my scope, but I think it's important that we study and consider the different options, which would include weekend voting.
Would you be able to table with this committee any of the research that you have with respect to that? That'd be very helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Romanado. Madame Gaudreau, à vous pour 6 minutes.
Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will gather up the information, the impression I get from all of this. I completely agree with the importance of this. I went through Vote in 1995. Now I'm in the Bloc Québécois. That tells you a lot. It's very important to have a good experience when you vote for the first or second time. I completely agree with that. Now, having said that, there's also human behavior at stake. when you have a lack of time versus when you have a lot of time, I can go tomorrow or the next day. Sometimes we see that when there's a broad time opportunity, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will vote more. Moreover, here in Canada, voting measures are very easy compared to what happens in municipalities or even, I'm talking about Quebec here. So accommodation, finding measures, legal and impartial measures for the chief electoral officer to do his job. I heard earlier, and I'll ask him about local recognition. I think we've had enough hours of study on cyber attacks and so on that we're very cautious. Now, I do realize and note that one day we'll lack resources. Then my colleague tells me we need more time, but young people must work. But those who don't work might be able to work. Well, there's no magic recipe, winning recipe here. I find it interesting that we're discussing this together because beyond what may be hidden, and I'm insinuating this, we change the date, it changes things for certain people. I'm not even going there. But in the final analysis, we have a chief electoral officer who's exceptional in this democracy, and we have to trust him. As in Quebec and elsewhere, he could push back. Why is it always Monday? Monday. If Monday is Thanksgiving, let's have it Tuesday. There's no winning solution here. Now, having said that, I think we're opening the door really wide because indeed, during there's the federal election, there's provincial ones and municipal. Of course, there'll be some overlap, but can we do it on purpose? Well, I think the chief electoral officer has all the expertise necessary to make these choices. What do you think?
Comes to selecting the election date itself, yes, I think having confidence in a nonpartisan chief electoral officer is obviously ideal. And I do think that, and I know from experience having worked with them, that they do put a lot of thought and time into thinking through exactly how to administer the election in a way that where it's open to as many people as possible.
Je vais vous poser la question à Monsieur.
I'll put the same question to Mr. Mulroy. If we consider vocal recognition with biometrics, there are many financial institutions that use that method. Has that been analyzed? Because I lived with my father who was vulnerable. He needed to be accompanied. So to my mind, it's important, and there are solutions rather than having big changes. Would vocal recognition be something that has been considered and analyzed?
Thank you for your question. The reliance in telephone voting comes from a 1998 report from Elections Canada that KPMG authored, saying that was the most secure and accessible means of voting. So that's the reliance here. I mean, a colleague had brought up the efficacy of voting online, and there are obvious concerns with security when we look to wholesale online voting, but telephone voting for disabled Canadians is not quite the same whole-scale change to the current format. In terms of the current means for voting for Mr. Ceci, for example, so through the special voting procedures, he is able to use a Braille template or have a third party cast his vote for him. Mr. Ceci has relied on a glucose meter and has lost sensation in the tips of his fingers, so unfortunately he's not able to use Braille, and obviously there is accessibility issues relying on Braille. If he were able to use Braille, he could not independently confirm that his vote was cast or not spoiled, for example. And relying on a third party, he wholly loses the ability to confirm the accuracy of his ballot. So while there are certainly things to explore in terms of telephone voting are.
Il me reste 30 secondes. J'ai vraiment.
I have 30 seconds left. I really get that the KPMG report from which you drew inspiration, and I'd like to know whether the impartiality of the Chief Electoral Officer, now that we've heard so many recommendations, do you still believe that he's the one who should make the choice of what changes need to occur?
That's a difficult question to ask. I would say that the mandate was clearly handed to the Chief Electoral Officer some time ago, and there's been quite a failure on the part of Elections Canada to fulfill that mandate. And I think I would leave my answer there.
Merci, Madame Gaudreau.
Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau.
The floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the witnesses that are here today, and thank you for the important testimony that you've provided to date. Ms. Rouch, I'm going to start with you. The first question that I have, in your opening statement, you had talked about the importance of genuine democratic discourse in our increasingly digital world. And I'm wondering if you can provide an example or two of what it is that you're hearing or experiencing from young adults and youth, of what they're experiencing online. Just could you give us a little bit of a picture of what that looks like?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think it's very interesting. We participated in a study on polarization with the Public Policy Forum a few years ago and did a number of focus groups with young people around how they were feeling about online discourse and how it either helped or didn't their sense of democratic participation or their desire to. And I think the prevailing feedback that we got was that it just made them feel disconnected. It made them feel disconnected from confused about their own opinions, disconnected from other citizens, uncertain about our institutions. And I think that the general sort of confusion and swirl and sort of anxiety of engaging online created really difficult circumstances for them to assess, make decisions, understand how people they respect and care about think about things, and it made discourse more difficult. So a lot of conversations are happening online in an environment that is incredibly polarized, increasingly extreme, and just generally, as you're sort of trying to figure out your own political orientations, not conducive to good civic discourse.
Thank you so much. And was it your sense that that also impacted voter turnout?
I think what we know about barriers to voting, specifically with respect to motivational barriers, there's sort of access barriers, which we've discussed a little bit about today with respect to electors with disabilities. But I think on the other side, there are the sort of the motivational barriers that keep people from getting to the polling stations. A lack of trust in institutions can be a major one, a sense that your vote isn't going to make a difference, a sense that these are the things that we hear over and over, and I can say across thousands of conversations, elected officials don't care about me, the parties are the same. There's a sort of sense that, they don't trust and don't feel a part of that system, and I think that can certainly be aggravated by the way that discourse takes place online.
Thank you so much. I think it reinforces the importance of some of the components of this bill as well. I'm going to move on to Mr. Mulroy. Mr. Mulroy, I'm sorry that you weren't able to provide your testimony at the last meeting along with Mr. Stacey. I'm happy that arrangements were made for you to be here today. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more high level, of course, but can you just explain in a minute or less, how does telephone voting really work? What does that look like for somebody that wants to cast their ballot through telephone voting if it were available?
Certainly, well, I'll leave the fine details of it to people far more educated than I. But it would, individuals who would qualify for telephone voting, so individuals who have barriers to polling station, or individuals like Mr. Stacey with visual impairments who cannot meaningfully cast their ballot on a paper ballot. What's been proposed is that they would receive a verified code and that they would be able to call and cast their ballot via phone. Today, most individuals, including those in low socioeconomic positions, have access to telephones, so it's quite an accessible means at casting a ballot. You would be able to phone a designated phone number, verify who you are, verify your identity, and then cast the ballot for the individual that you would choose to vote for.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, Mr. Malloy, if you have any sense as to what it is that's creating barriers in being able to move forward with something like this. Are you hearing any information that I'm not as to why this has not been put into place so far?
I haven't a clue. It seems that the data has been there for over 25 years now, and the mandate has been clear to the Chief Electoral Officer for decades that something needs to be done to make voting more accessible for Canadians, and there's been an abject failure to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Malloy. Could you do you think that the lack of options for people living with disabilities to be able to cast their ballots in an autonomous way, in a way that they are confident in their ballot, do you think that that is a barrier in them being able to, do you think that's a barrier in voter turnout for people living with disabilities?
Without question, and the data also supports that there's a significant gap in voter turnout for persons with disability for precisely the reasons that you've listed.
Thank you so much. Ms. Roosh, you had talked about the importance of on-campus voting, and I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more. Some of the things that I've heard from students is not only the accessible option for them to be able to cast their ballot while on campus, but also to see the community coming on campus to participate in this, very important democratic process of casting your ballot. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more around how important it is that we see on-campus ballot offered consistently every time that there's an election happening.
Yeah, certainly, and I definitely agree with those assessments, and I'll actually add that I think one of the barriers that we see with students in particular, and as was mentioned previously, voting in your first two elections can set a habit for lifelong participation. So it's a really key time to sort of get voters voting in their first election. And on campus, or students, who are studying away from home for the first time, often it's like a big change in their lives, and they're likely living away from home for the first time. And so there are some unique barriers there around not being certain which riding they should vote in, which one they're registered in, whether it's at home with mom and dad or, in their new home, whether or not, they may not receive a voter information card for that reason. They may not have their parents there to remind them. So sort of adding these on-campus polling stations allows for that community to spring up around them, but also allows them to vote in their home riding in the riding they're registered, which could be not in the riding they're residing in, or could be there, but at least provides the resources to help them figure that out and allow them to cast their ballot and exercise their charter rights in that way.
Thank you very much, Ms. Barron. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I'll be moving the following motion. That given that the committee has learned that staff from the Prime Minister's office and the Office of the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs met with NDP party representatives from the PCO and the Chief Electoral Officer on January 25, 2024 on matters relating to Bill C-65, and that the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs, along with his Parliamentary Secretary and staff from his office and the Parliamentary Secretary's office met with NDP party representatives and NDP Member of Parliament, representatives from the PCO and the Chief Electoral Officer on March 30th, 2024 on matters relating to Bill C-65, the Committee A, order the Office of the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs and the PMO to provide the committee with all of the dates on which any representatives from the Liberal Party, including party officials, ministers, parliamentary secretaries, ministers' office staff, and members of Parliament met with any representatives from the NDP, including party officials and members of Parliament on matters relating to Bill C-65, and the names and titles of the individuals who attended those meetings. B, order the production of any documents under the control of the PCO, PMO, any minister's office, and Elections Canada, including any documents used as briefing materials in any of those meetings, and any records of conversations, including emails, text messages, or any other form of communication about those meetings, and any records of discussions that took place at those meetings and or decisions that were made at those meetings, and that these documents are to be provided to the clerk with no redactions within 1 week of the adoption of this motion. And C, invite Daniel Blakey, former Member of Parliament for Elmwood Transcona and former Democratic Reform critic for the NDP and co-author of Bill C-65, to appear before the committee on its study of Bill C-65.
Okay. Colleagues, do you have a question? Going to just very briefly suspend, because I imagine members do not have a copy of this at the moment, certainly not dans les deux langues officielles. Alors,
Certainly don't have it in both official languages. Ms. Gaudreau, you don't have a copy. Ms. Fortier?
I'm going to suspend briefly. Witnesses, I'm going to forewarn you that I imagine, unfortunately, this is going to potentially take a couple of minutes, and I do not have the ability to extend the meeting today. So bear with us, but there is a possibility here that we may unfortunately not have any time remaining for you. Colleagues, I'm just suspending in order to allow for the distribution of the motion in both official languages. I have a copy of the motion presented by Mr. Cooper in both official languages. Mr. Cooper retains the floor, and I'll turn it back over to him.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I have put forward this motion, given what we have learned at this committee, namely that the NDP met with the minister, the officials in the minister's office, the PCO, the PMO, and the chief electoral officer on at least two occasions regarding the drafting of Bill C-65, which has been held out by the Liberals as an elections bill, but it turns out that what it really is a pensions bill disguised as an elections bill, because buried within this so-called elections bill is a clause that would secure the pensions of soon-to-be defeated Liberal MPs. And I might add, soon-to-be defeated NDP MPs. The situation that the Prime Minister faces is that he is the most unpopular Prime Minister in more than 30 years. Canadians are tired of this corrupt Liberal government, and he knows it, and Liberal MPs know it. The problem that they have is that the Prime Minister must call an election by October 20th, 2025. And that means that soon-to-be defeated Liberal MPs elected in 2019 won't qualify for their pension. So what does the Minister of Democratic Institutions do, he sneaks into this bill a clause that pushes the date of the next election back by a week under the guise of a conflict with Diwali. But guess what? By moving the election back by 1 week, suddenly soon to be defeated Liberal MPs will qualify for their pension. It is why this bill came to be known as the Loser Liberal Pension Protection Act. And it is, I must say, about as cynical and as dishonest as it gets from this cynical, dishonest, and corrupt Liberal government. But while this bill has become known as the Loser Liberal Pension Protection Act, it seems it might be better known as the Loser NDP Liberal Pension Protection Act, given the role that we now learned that the NDP played in drafting this legislation. And when the minister was here, he had an opportunity to clarify exactly how many times he met behind closed doors with NDP party officials, with Daniel Blaikie and other NDP members of Parliament, to devise this scheme to pad the pockets of soon-to-be defeated Liberal and NDP MPs, and the minister refused to answer. And so, very simply, Mr. Chair, when the minister, when NDP MPs and officials in the PMO, PCO, and so on meet behind closed doors, Canadians deserve transparency when they meet behind closed doors to cynically and dishonestly concoct this scheme to pad their pensions. There must be transparency, and that is what this motion provides for, to require the minister and the Prime Minister's office to disclose just how many meetings were held, to produce any communications surrounding the discussions that led to this pensions bill disguised as an elections bill, and to hear from the co-author of this bill, former NDP MP Daniel Blaikie. It's a common sense motion. As the Prime Minister often liked to say, sunshine is the best disinfectant. Well, this will provide a lot of sunshine on what is a very dark and cynical attempt to pad the pockets of Liberal and NDP MPs.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Cooper. Colleagues, we are at 1 o'clock and we are out of resources. So I'm going to move to adjourn at this point. Pardon me?
Could we not call the question? There's no other speakers. I pulled my name. If we take 1 minute to poll just to call the question, I think that would be worthwhile.
Well, I'm looking around to see if there are any colleagues that want to speak to this. Ms. Barron?
So if I do have some things to say on this, so do we have the time for me to speak to it? This is what I'm
No,
trying to
we
figure
don't.
out.
So, so just to be clear here, I'm going to move to adjourn the meeting.
Yeah.
If you, because we don't have time, we don't have resources to get into a longer debate. If the meeting is adjourned, then we would have to revisit this if a member wanted to reintroduce the motion and then have a vote at that later date. If there's nobody left on the speaking list right now, then we would have time for that vote. But my sense is you're indicating that you do want to speak, which we don't have time for now, meaning that we will adjourn. We will not have a vote because there'll still be a speaker on the list, which would be you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's only fair that I be added to the speaking list. And
Okay, then in that case, we cannot go to a vote as we have speakers that want to speak to the motion. However, we don't have resources to continue the meeting. So I'm going to move to adjourn the meeting. Thank you, colleagues.